Wolfgang von Trips. In September 1961, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza drew the elite of Formula One racing. Among them was Count Wolfgang von Trips, a German nobleman whose aristocratic background seemed at odds with the dangerous world of motor racing. Von Trips was just 2 races away from securing the world championship for Ferrari, a position that had put him at the center of attention that weekend. On lap 2 of the race, von Trips' Ferrari was traveling at over 150 miles per hour on the approach of the Parabolica curve. Alongside him was Jim Clark's Lotus. In a split second, their wheels touched. The contact was minimal, but at such speeds it was disastrous. Von Trips' Ferrari became instantly unstable. The car pitched sideways, then became airborne. Like a missile without guidance, the Ferrari sailed toward the spectator area, where fans stood watching behind a low fence. They had no time to react. The car slammed into the crowd and fence with savage force. Metal twisted and shredded. The impact threw Von Trips from his cockpit, his body tumbling across the ground like a rag doll. His helmet tore off. His unprotected head struck the track surface repeatedly. Witnesses described a scene of chaos and horror. Blood stained the grass. 15 spectators lay dead or dying, their bodies broken by the impact of the Ferrari or sliced by its metal components. Emergency services were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Von Trips himself lay motionless on the track. His neck had been broken in the violent ejection from the car. He had died instantly upon impact with the ground, his body still warm as officials reached him. The race continued despite the tragedy. As cars roared past the accident scene, officials covered Von Trips' body with a tarpaulin. The Germans' championship dreams ended there on the Monza asphalt. His life cut short at 33, and his title hopes handed to his teammate Phil Hill, who became world champion that day. Ayrton Senna. On May 1st, 1994, the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola was under a dark cloud. Just one day earlier, Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger had died during qualifying. Despite this, Ayrton Senna, the 3-time world champion and arguably the greatest Formula One driver in history, took his place on the starting grid. His Williams car sat in pole position, a familiar spot for the Brazilian master. The race began, and Senna pulled away as expected. On the 7th lap, his car entered the high-speed Tamburello corner at approximately 190 miles per hour. What happened next would be scrutinized for years to come. The Williams suddenly veered off course, continuing straight where the track curved left. In the final seconds, telemetry showed Senna desperately trying to slow the car. He managed to reduce his speed to about 135 miles per hour before impact, but it wasn't enough. The Williams slammed into the concrete barrier at an angle that proved fatal. Upon impact, a piece of the suspension broke free. Like a javelin, it pierced through the carbon fiber helmet and into Senna's head. The right front tire and suspension assembly were driven back into the cockpit, striking his helmet with tremendous force. Blood pooled inside his helmet immediately. When medical teams reached him, Senna was still sitting in his car, motionless but alive. His head tilted slightly, blood seeping from underneath his visor. Track doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy at the scene, knowing every second was critical. The helicopter waited to transport him to Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. Though his heart was still beating, brain scans revealed devastating injuries. At 6:40 p.m., doctors announced what millions feared. Ayrton Senna was dead. Brazil declared the 3 days of national mourning. An estimated 3 million people lined the streets of Sao Paulo for his funeral procession. The driver who had seemed invincible on track was gone at 34, his legend immortalized in that final fatal moment at Tamburello. Roland Ratzenberger. On April 30th, 1994, the qualifying session for the San Marino Grand Prix was underway at Imola. Roland Ratzenberger, an Austrian driver competing in only his 3rd Formula One race, was pushing hard in his Simtek Ford. At 34, Ratzenberger was older than most rookies, having worked his way up through the ranks of motorsport with determination rather than fanfare. During his fast lap, Ratzenberger's car struck a curb at the Acque Minerali chicane. The impact damaged his front wing, but instead of returning to the pits, he continued his qualifying run. Engineers watching from the pit wall could see the wing wobbling precariously as the car sped down the straight. As he approached the Villeneuve curve at over 190 miles per hour, the compromised carbon fiber wing finally failed. In an instant, it folded under the car, eliminating all downforce and rendering the Simtek uncontrollable. Ratzenberger was now merely a passenger in a missile without guidance. The car veered sharply to the right. Onboard telemetry recorded a momentary desperate correction on the steering wheel before impact. It was futile. The Simtek slammed into the concrete wall at barely diminished speed. The impact was so violent that Ratzenberger's head snapped forward against the cockpit, causing a basilar skull fracture. The safety harness that kept him in the car became the mechanism of fatal injury as his body stayed fixed while his head moved violently forward. When marshals reached the scene, Ratzenberger was motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Medical teams worked frantically, removing him from the wreckage and beginning CPR. A helicopter waited nearby to evacuate him to Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. Despite their efforts, Ratzenberger was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause was listed as a basilar skull fracture, an injury that would later lead to mandatory head and neck support devices in motorsport. His death, though soon overshadowed by Senna's the following day, marked the first fatality in a Grand Prix weekend in 12 years. Tom Pryce. On March 5, 1977, the South African Grand Prix was underway at Kyalami. Tom Pryce, a talented Welsh driver for the Shadow team, was known for his natural speed and quiet determination. At 27, he was considered a future champion by many in the paddock, his career just beginning to flourish in the dangerous world of 1970s Formula One. On lap 22, Renzo Zorzi's car pulled off the track with a minor engine fire. Two marshals from the opposite side of the circuit ran across the track to assist with fire extinguishers. The first made it across safely. The second, 19-year-old Frederik Jansen van Vuren, was not so fortunate. As Pryce crested the rise after the main straight, he was traveling at approximately 170 miles per hour. The marshal suddenly appeared in front of him, crossing directly into his path. There was no time to react, no possibility of avoidance. The impact was devastating. The Shadow hit Van Vuren with such force that the marshal's body was thrown high into the air, landing hundreds of feet away. His body was so badly mutilated that officials initially could not identify which marshal it was. But the horror did not end there. The 40-pound fire extinguisher that Van Vuren had been carrying was struck by Pryce's car. It became a deadly projectile, flying directly into Pryce's face at relative speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. The extinguisher struck Pryce's helmet with devastating force, partially lifting his helmet and causing fatal injuries to his head. The impact was so severe that the full-face helmet offered no meaningful protection. Pryce's car continued down the straight, no longer controlled by its driver. With Pryce already dead at the wheel, the Shadow veered into Jacques Laffitte's Ligier before finally coming to rest. When officials reached the car, they found Pryce still strapped in the cockpit, his face unrecognizable from the impact. The race continued around the two covered bodies on and near the circuit, the red flag procedures of the era not deemed necessary for these deaths. Ronnie Peterson. On September 10, 1978, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza began in chaos. Ronnie Peterson, the Swedish driver nicknamed Super Swede for his spectacular driving style, was in his Black Lotus starting from the grid's midfield. Tall, blonde, and universally liked in the paddock, Peterson was one of Formula One's most popular figures. As the lights changed, the pack of powerful cars accelerated toward the first chicane. The narrow track couldn't accommodate the 24 cars fighting for position. James Hunt's McLaren veered slightly, touching another car. In an instant, what had been an orderly grid became a mass of spinning, colliding machinery. Peterson's Lotus was pushed into the barriers at high speed. The impact was violent, crushing the front of the car and trapping his legs in the twisted metal. Within seconds, the wreckage erupted in flames. Fuel from ruptured tanks ignited, surrounding Peterson in fire. Several drivers, including James Hunt, stopped and ran back to the burning Lotus. They pulled Peterson from the inferno before he suffered severe burns, but the damage to his legs was already done. Both were badly broken, with multiple compound fractures clearly visible as they laid him on the track surface. When medical crews arrived, Peterson was conscious and talking. His injuries, while serious, didn't appear life-threatening. He was transported to Niguarda Hospital in Milan, where x-rays confirmed at least 27 fractures in his legs and feet. Doctors decided to operate immediately to stabilize the fractures. What no one realized was that bone marrow from the multiple fractures had already entered Peterson's bloodstream. During the night, he developed fat embolism syndrome. Tiny globules of fat began blocking small blood vessels in his lungs and brain. His breathing became labored. His organs started failing one by one as oxygen couldn't reach his tissues. By morning, Peterson was in critical condition. His wife, Barbara, rushed to his bedside but arrived too late. At 9:55 a.m. on September 11th, Ronnie Peterson died at age 34, not from burns or immediate trauma, but from the insidious internal damage that no one had detected in time. Jules Bianchi. On October 5th, 2014, the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka was being lashed by torrential rain from an approaching typhoon. The race had started under safety car conditions and visibility was poor. Jules Bianchi, a 25-year-old French driver for Marussia and a Ferrari Academy prospect, was fighting hard to earn his team valuable championship points. By lap 43, the rain had intensified. Adrian Seudel-Sauber had already aquaplaned off the track at the Dunlop curve, hitting the tire barrier. A recovery crane had been dispatched to remove Seudel's car, positioned just beyond the runoff area. As Bianchi approached the same corner, his car began to hydroplane on the wet surface. He lost control at approximately 134 miles per hour, sliding off at virtually the same point as Seudel had moments before. But unlike Seudel, Bianchi's trajectory took him directly toward the recovery vehicle. The Marussia slid beneath the rear of the 13-ton crane. There was no safety skirt to prevent such an intrusion. The impact sheared off the roll hoop of Bianchi's car and caused a deceleration measured at 254 G, among the highest ever recorded in motorsport. The blow was crushing. Bianchi's helmet struck the underside of the crane with tremendous force. Although the carbon fiber shell remained intact, the sudden deceleration caused devastating diffuse axonal injury to his brain. When medical teams reached him, he was unconscious, but breathing. Carefully extracted from the destroyed cockpit, Bianchi was transported by ambulance to Mee University Hospital. Neurosurgeons performed immediate emergency surgery to address the critical brain trauma, but the prognosis was grim from the start. Bianchi never regained consciousness. For 9 months, he remained in a coma, his family maintaining a constant vigil. Machines kept him breathing, while doctors repeatedly explained the irreversible nature of his brain injuries. On July 17, 2015, Jules Bianchi died at a hospital in Nice, France, still just 25 years old. He became the first driver to die from racing injuries in Formula One in 21 years, breaking a safety record that the sport had been proud of since Ayrton Senna's death. Jochen Rindt, on September 5, 1970, qualifying for the Italian Grand Prix was underway at the Monza circuit. Jochen Rindt, an Austrian driver known for his spectacular car control and fearless style, was leading the championship by a substantial margin. At 28, he had finally secured a competitive car with the Lotus team, after years of struggle in less reliable machinery. Rindt was pushing hard during the session, determined to secure pole position despite concerns about his car's safety. The Lotus 72 was fast but fragile, its designer Colin Chapman infamous for building cars that were light, innovative, and often on the edge of structural integrity. As Rindt approached the Parabolica corner at approximately 175 miles per hour, something went catastrophically wrong. Later investigation would reveal that a brake shaft had failed, causing a sudden and complete loss of braking power. In that split second, Rindt became a passenger in an uncontrollable machine. The Lotus veered sharply to the left, skidding across the track toward the guardrail. There was no runoff area in 1970, just a thin metal barrier between the track and the trees beyond. The Lotus slammed underneath the guardrail at tremendous speed, the metal edge slicing through the front of the car like a knife. Rindt was wearing only a lap belt, having refused to use the available shoulder straps because they inhibited his movement in the cockpit. This decision proved fatal. As the car violently decelerated, Rindt's body continued forward. The impact forced him down in the cockpit, the edge of the steering wheel crushing his throat and chest against the lap belt. When track workers reached the scene, they found Rindt still alive but unconscious and gravely injured. His throat had been severely traumatized, cutting off his airway. Despite frantic efforts to save him, Jochen Rindt was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. The season continued without him, but no driver could overcome Rindt's points lead. 2 months later, he became Formula One's only posthumous world champion, his widow Nina collecting the trophy he would never hold. François Cevert. On October 6, 1973, the final qualifying session for the United States Grand Prix was underway at Watkins Glen. François Cevert, the handsome 29-year-old French driver for Tyrrell, was being groomed as the successor to his teammate and mentor Jackie Stewart. With his movie star looks and natural speed, Cevert represented the future of Formula One, a rising star in a dangerous era. Stewart was set to retire after this race, his 100th Grand Prix, and had been teaching Cevert everything he knew. The Frenchman was determined to show his readiness to lead the team with a strong qualifying performance that Saturday morning. As Cevert approached the challenging uphill S's section at approximately 150 miles per hour, his Tyrrell suddenly snapped to the right. What caused the initial loss of control would never be definitively determined. The car struck the right side guardrail with tremendous force, then ricocheted across the track into the left side barrier. The second impact was even more violent than the first. The Tyrrell hit at such an angle that it was launched into a terrifying series of rotations. The car began to disintegrate, parts scattering across the track as the monocoque twisted and contorted. The force was so extreme that the guardrail buckled, creating a gap that allowed the car to partially pass through. When the Tyrrell finally came to rest, it was nearly unrecognizable. The blue car had been torn apart, with Cevert still strapped inside what remained of the cockpit. The barriers had sliced through the vehicle, effectively cutting it in two. Jackie Stewart, following behind on track, came upon the scene moments later. He immediately recognized the destroyed blue car and stopped. What he saw was so horrific that he would later refuse to describe it in detail. Cevert had suffered fatal injuries, his body partially dismembered by the metal barriers. Death had been instantaneous. Officials quickly covered the wreckage with a tarpaulin. The Tyrrell team immediately withdrew from the race, Jackie Stewart's illustrious career ending not with a final race, but with the death of his protege. Piers Courage. On June 21, 1970, the Dutch Grand Prix was being held at the Zandvoort circuit. Piers Courage, a British driver from a wealthy brewing family, was piloting a De Tomaso car for the Frank Williams team. At 28, Courage was known for his aristocratic background and devil-may-care attitude, a throwback to the gentleman racers of an earlier era. By lap 23, Courage was pushing hard, the De Tomaso's Ford Cosworth engine howling as he navigated the circuit's flowing curves. As he approached the fast right-hander at Tunnel Oost, disaster struck. The suspension on his car suddenly failed, likely due to metal fatigue that had gone undetected. Without Without warning, the De Tomaso veered off the track at nearly 150 miles per hour. The car slammed into the soft sand that lined the circuit, digging in and beginning a violent series of rolls. With each impact, pieces of the car were torn away. One of the front wheels, still attached to its suspension assembly, was ripped off and sent flying. In a cruel twist of fate, this wheel and suspension unit came down directly on the cockpit area. The impact was violent, causing fatal head injuries to Courage instantly. But what followed made the scene even more horrific. The magnesium components of the De Tomaso's chassis, lightweight but highly flammable, ignited upon impact. Within seconds, the wreckage was engulfed in intense white-hot flames that burned at over 3,000 degrees. Magnesium fires cannot be extinguished by conventional means, and the heat was so intense that marshals could not approach. Inside the burning chassis, Courage's body was consumed by the inferno. The heat was so extreme that even his helmet melted in the blaze. Track workers stood helplessly by, unable to intervene as the fire burned with unstoppable ferocity. When the flames finally subsided, leaving only a blackened chassis, medical officials were faced with the grim task of recovering what remained. The severity of the fire had made the scene nearly unrecognizable as a racing car. The race continued, with Jackie Stewart eventually taking victory, though his celebrations were notably subdued. Riccardo Paletti. On June 13, 1982, the Canadian Grand Prix was about to begin on the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in Montreal. Among the drivers on the grid was Riccardo Paletti, a 23-year-old Italian rookie competing in only his second Formula One race. Driving for the small Osella team, Paletti was determined to make his mark in the sport after a difficult debut at the Monaco Grand Prix earlier that season. As the starter raised the green flag, Didier Pironi's Ferrari stalled on pole position. Yellow warning lights flashed. But in the days before sophisticated radio communications, many drivers at the back had no way of knowing about the stationary car ahead. The field began to navigate around the stranded Ferrari, but Paletti, starting from the back, had limited visibility. By the time he saw Pironi's car, it was too late. Paletti's Osella slammed into the back of the Ferrari at nearly 110 miles per hour. The impact was so violent that the front of Paletti's car was completely crushed, driving the front suspension and engine back into the cockpit where Paletti sat strapped in. The young Italian was pinned in the wreckage, conscious but unable to move as his chest was crushed against the steering column. Rescue workers frantically tried to reach him, but their efforts were complicated when fuel began leaking from the ruptured tanks. Just 30 seconds after the initial impact, the spilled fuel ignited. Flames engulfed the wrecked Osella with Paletti still trapped inside. Pironi and several marshals fought the fire with extinguishers, temporarily keeping the flames at bay long enough for medical personnel to reach Paletti. When they finally extracted him from the burning wreckage, Paletti was still alive but barely breathing. His chest had been crushed on impact, causing massive internal injuries. He was immediately transported to the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, where doctors fought desperately to save him. Despite their best efforts, the trauma was too severe. Riccardo Paletti was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, having suffered fatal chest injuries from the initial impact rather than the subsequent fire. Mark Donohue. On August 17, 1975, practice for the Austrian Grand Prix was underway at the Österreich-Ring. Mark Donohue, an American racing driver known as Captain Nice for his analytical approach and engineering background, was behind the wheel of his Penske-owned March. At 38, he had already achieved success in numerous racing disciplines, from Can-Am to NASCAR, even winning the Indianapolis 500. As Donohue approached a fast section of the circuit, a tire on his March suddenly failed. The car veered off the track at high speed, careening toward the barriers. In a desperate attempt to slow the car, Donohue managed to steer away from the solid guardrail, instead crashing into a set of catch fencing and advertising hoardings. The impact wasn't particularly violent by Formula One standards. The car broke through the fencing and came to rest without the devastating damage typically seen in fatal accidents. Donohue was able to extract himself from the car and stand on his own. He appeared shaken but largely unharmed, complaining only of a headache. Track medical staff examined him briefly at the scene and found no obvious injuries. The headache was dismissed as a likely result of the impact, something routine for racing drivers of the era. Donohue walked away from the crash, returning to his hotel to rest. During the night, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The headache intensified to unbearable levels. By morning, Donohue was vomiting and confused, classic symptoms of what doctors would later identify as a cerebral hemorrhage. A seemingly minor piece of debris had struck his helmet during the crash, causing bleeding inside his brain that was slowly building pressure. By the time he reached the hospital in Graz, Donohue was slipping in and out of consciousness. Surgeons operated immediately to relieve the pressure on his brain, but the internal damage was too extensive. Mark Donohue died 2 days after the accident without regaining consciousness, the delayed nature of his fatal injury leaving teammates and friends in shock. What had seemed like a minor incident had claimed one of racing's most respected figures through an invisible, creeping death. Patrick Depailler. On August 1st, 1980, the Hockenheimring in Germany was quiet except for the sound of a single Formula One car. Patrick Depailler, the 35-year-old French driver known for his flamboyant driving style and passion for motorcycles, was conducting a private test session for the Alfa Romeo team. The weekend's German Grand Prix was approaching, and Depailler was determined to improve the car's setup. The Hockenheim circuit of 1980 was a fearsome track with long straights cutting through dense forest. The most challenging section was the Ostkurve, a fast left-hand bend that required absolute precision and commitment. Drivers approached it at over 170 miles per hour with only thin barriers separating them from the trees beyond. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Depailler was on his fourth lap of the day. As he entered the Ostkurve, something on the car failed completely. Later investigation suggested a suspension component had broken, though some speculated that a tire failure was to blame. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The Alfa Romeo became instantly uncontrollable at maximum speed. The car snapped sideways, then became airborne. For a brief moment, the red machine flew through the air before slamming into the Armco barriers with devastating force. The impact was so violent that the car disintegrated, pieces scattering across the track and into the forest. The cockpit section, with Depailler still strapped inside, came to rest against the mangled barriers. There was no fire, but the damage to the car and driver had already been done. The impact forces had caused massive trauma to Depailler's body, crushing his chest and head. When track workers reached the wreckage, they found Depailler motionless. There was no need for medical intervention. The force of the crash had killed him instantly. His body remained in the twisted cockpit, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, a final testament to a racer who never lifted off the throttle. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. Depailler, a man who had survived countless motorcycle accidents and previously broken both legs in a hang-gliding crash, had died while testing safety improvements to a car that ultimately could not save him. Helmuth Koinigg. On October 6, 1974, the United States Grand Prix was underway at Watkins Glen. Helmuth Koinigg, a 25-year-old Austrian rookie, was driving the uncompetitive Surtees car in only his second Formula One race. Despite his limited experience at the sport's highest level, he had shown promise and a methodical approach to learning the difficult track. On the 10th lap, Koinigg was navigating the challenging Watkins Glen circuit when disaster struck in the most mundane form. His right front tire suddenly deflated as he approached the sweeping right-hander at the end of the straight. Under normal circumstances, such a failure would lead to a controlled slide into the barriers, uncomfortable but rarely fatal. The car skidded off the track at approximately 140 miles per hour. Koinigg braced for impact as the Surtees approached the guardrail. What should have been a simple barrier designed to absorb energy and protect drivers, instead became the instrument of his death. The bottom portion of the guardrail had been improperly installed. When Koinigg's car hit the barrier, instead of deflecting or crumpling as designed, the metal rail gave way at the bottom while remaining intact at the top. This created a deadly guillotine effect. The Surtees slid underneath the top portion of the guardrail with terrible precision. The metal edge of the barrier struck the cockpit exactly at Koinigg's eye level. In an instant, the top of his helmet and his head were severed cleanly from his body. When track marshals reached the scene seconds later, they were confronted with a horror beyond imagination. Koinigg's body remained strapped in the driving position, the safety harness having functioned perfectly to keep his torso in place. But where his head should have been, there was nothing. The race continued as Koinigg's covered body was removed from the track. The public announcement merely stated that the Austrian had been involved in an accident. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.